I, in my early 30s, I'd been an openly gay writer long enough for the gossip to circulate widely in North Carolina. "I'm proud of you," he said, lifting his glass. I thanked him with a smile. "Took me long enough, didn't it?" "You and me both," he said. And just like that, he came out to me. It occurred to me then that we had both found it easier to camouflage our queerness on the fringes of academia. He on the left, I on the right. Our constant political grandstanding had been a distraction from a deeper, more difficult truth, the one that had to be hidden at any cost.
Armistead Maupin is the best-selling author of the 9-volume Tales of the City series and other novels, including Maybe the Moon and The Night Listener. His groundbreaking activism for LGBTQ rights earned him the 2012 Lambda Literary Foundation's Pioneer Award, and his life and fiction have been the subject of television series, musicals, and most recently an award-winning documentary, The Untold Tales of Armistead Maupin, directed by Jennifer Crute. Tonight he'll be discussing his highly anticipated memoir, Logical Family. The San Francisco Chronicle praises it as engaging and revelatory, a delight punctuating a distinguished career in letters. Publishers Weekly writes, "The true prize here is the cleverness with which Maupin bears his soul," and continues, quote, "He has crafted a nuanced reflection on what it means to love and be loved in a flawed but beautiful world." We're so pleased to host him at the Brattle Theater tonight. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Armistead Maupin.
The last time, well, it probably wasn't the last time, but I was at the Brattle Theater doing a reading in 1989 on the day that the Loma Prieta earthquake happened in San Francisco. And they had a big meeting backstage to decide whether or not they should tell me. And decided against it, which was probably a good idea because I would have been too rattled and would have wanted to call my friends. So if the orange baboon has fired a rocket in the last 10 minutes, I trust no one will tell me or see the tweet and shout it from the audience. We'll let this be a little moment of peace and obliviousness. It was so interesting. On the way over here, the limousine driver was very curious about me, and as limousine drivers often are, and said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I write books, and I'm on a book tour right now." "How many books have you written?" And I said, 11. 11 books? He said, "Would you do me a favor? Would you call a man who's like a father to me? He's 85 years old, and he's like my father, and talk to him on the phone." It really actually sounded like fun, so I like being given so little information to work with, and he loves books so much you can't get in his house. It's so full of books. That sounded sort of sweet, and so he said his name is Nick Johnson, and I said he became my father when I moved from Morocco. And I said, "What is your name?" "Mohammed." So he called Nick Johnson and put this old man on the phone, older than I am. And we had a little guy said, "There's a very nice young man here who loves you so much that he wanted me to talk to you." And he said, "Oh, well, what have you written?" And I told him, and he said, "It sounds kind of familiar." I was prepared for that. I once reminded Carol Channing that I had had dinner with her once, and she said, "Well, the face is familiar." So Nick Johnson said, "Thank you so much for calling. God bless you." And I said, "God bless you too." And the driver walked me up to the theater here, and he said, "Thank you so much for doing that. Chuck Schumer did that for me last week." And I thought, "You whore." I thought I was the only... Anyway. I like waiting until the night of decide what pieces of the book I will read, and there was something about, you know, driving through this wonderful free academic environment full of young people learning that made me think I should do my Chapel Hill chapters, because it gives you a brief idea of what a nightmare I was back then, and I've not done it yet, so I'd kind of like to try it on you. And there's something the summer before. And the summer before we left for college, Clark, my best friend, and I went to work for the North Carolina Civil War Centennial Commission. The job was a perfect way to keep on romancing the Confederacy, since we helped preserve artifacts from a blockade runner that had been sunk in the ocean off the coast of Fort Fisher. These were war provisions. You know, I'm going to have to ask for some help here.
I'm willing to stand over your shoulder with a lighting hand if you want.
That's very sweet of you. And I didn't take that to the nasty place I could have taken it. That's good, Alex, thanks. These were provisions that never made it to the Confederacy from England. Muskets and fancy-handled knives and brass tourniquet screws that had been salvaged from the deep exactly 100 years after they went under. Our task was to lower them into ditches filled with formaldehyde in the mosquito-ruled woods of Fort Fisher. This was half a century ago, I have to remind myself, a time so removed from the present that a team of zealous young volunteers recently returned to the site for a new act of earnest archaeology, excavating the very ditch Clark and I had eventually abandoned. We lived with a Navy diving team in a shabby apartment house in the coastal town of Curie Beach. Our room was so sparsely, I feel like the sound is coming in and out here. Is it to you? All right, good. Our room was so sparsely furnished that we made shelves from wooden fish grates we found discarded at a dock. We gave them a good scrubbing and were proud of their rustic maritime appearance until their scent reasserted itself. Clark typically refused to be discouraged and sprayed the crates with an aerosol deodorizer we found on top of the toilet. The end result was pine-scented fish guts, so we were forced to discard our only effort at decorating. That was the summer that Clark drove the pickup truck into the surf. The rest of the time, we used it to travel between our apartment and the preservation site, or sometimes to pick up provisions for the diving team in some rusty inferno of a shipyard on the Cape Fear River. I think of Clark in that truck, singing exuberantly, even though, and maybe because, we didn't have a radio. Sometimes we would sing together because Clark never showed the slightest embarrassment about sentimentality. He could sing Twilight Time as we drove home through the moonlit salt marshes and not have to joke about it. He held no attraction for me, nor I for him. I just loved his company. He made me think how nice it would be to live with a boy forever. I can see us there in that ditch of formaldehyde, holding the ends of a heavy block of rust that had once been a case of rifles. The metal was brittle, so we had to lower it slowly to keep from breaking it. The mosquitoes, meanwhile, were bellying up to the bar. Clark had chosen that moment to challenge, once again, my virginity. I just don't get it. I told you I'm saving it. For what? Marriage? A mosquito buzzed around my ear, looking for a meaty spot. You're crazy, man. We're in our sexual prime. Some things are better, you know, when you restrain yourself. Oh, what a prissy Aunt Pity-Pat I was. Clark's mud-spattered shoulders were bending under the weight of the rifle case, making him more sunken-chested than usual. He was no better at this than I was, but he managed to throw me a look. No way I'm going to restrain myself from pussy. A mosquito drilled into my arm. I held the rifle case in one hand so I could use the other to... I'm hitting the mic with my glasses, aren't I? Skeeter blood exploded lavishly across my arm. Clark barely took notice as I finally regained control of the case with both hands. All he says is, "I hope you're at least eating some." Eating what? Pussy! We lowered the rifle case together until it disappeared into the orange muck. I hoped this would finally bring an end to Clark's campaign, but no such luck. You know what I always say, show me a man who doesn't eat out his wife, and I'll show you a wife I can steal from that man. I couldn't picture skinny, geeky Clark stealing anyone's wife. I couldn't picture pussy either, for that matter, but I was fairly certain I didn't want to eat any. My focus that summer was on the youngest Navy diver on the team, a smooth-chested blonde who gave off the same heat as the guy on the cover of Demigods. When he hosed off his goggles and wetsuit outside the apartment house, I would find ways to talk to him. Small talk about our tinny-tasting tap water, or the sword he'd just recovered from the ocean, and I would say, "Oh man," more than I ever had, because I thought it might make me sound like a real guy, and I could buy more time with him. I hoped, too, that it would keep him from noticing how often I glanced at the glinting golden hairs on his arms and the peninsular bulge in his cotton shorts, shorts that were once red but had faded to pink from the sun. Is there a child enjoying this reading out there? Okay. I might have jerked off to the thought of those shorts. Had I been home in Raleigh. There, the only danger would be that my mother would enter my room in the morning and tell me, as she once had done, that it smelled like a tomcat in there. But Clark and I shared a room at Curie Beach, so I kept my hands off myself that summer. I was worried that he would hear the springs creaking and tease me about it, and even worse, bring up pussy again. Most nights we just drifted off in our fish crate stinking apartment to one of those 2 albums that I had brought from Raleigh. The soundtrack of Houseboat, starring Sophia Loren and Cary Grant, and a selection of performances from the Monterey Folk Festival, including Leadbelly and Joan Baez. Strange, I know, that I would be grooving to lefty movement songs, but art was already seeping into my consciousness in a way that rational thought could not. There would be no demigods on the menu that summer. A long evening, a big evening on the town was a movie in a dinky theater smelling of coppertone and carpet mold. Clark and I saw Summer and Smoke there, buzzed on Bush Bavarians from the diner next door, and right there in the cool, mildewed dark, Tennessee Williams crept into my tight-ass teenage heart. This was an unexpected thing. A few months earlier, I had written an essay for English class that railed against Williams and Faulkner and other Southern writers who, in my learned teenage estimation, had maligned and misrepresented our beloved homeland. Mrs. Peacock said I made an interesting case and sent it to an English teacher's magazine where it won an award and appeared in actual print. I had officially disapproved of Tennessee Williams, yet there I sat, giving it up to him completely, stunned by the realization that I was not Lawrence Harvey in this film. I was Geraldine Page. I was the lonely spinster, Miss Alma, whose yearning for love would always destroy the chance of it, and I was headed off to college in the fall. I felt so old that summer, older maybe than I would ever feel again. I know high school seems like the end of everything for some kids, certainly the ones who've left their glory days on the gridiron or under a crepe paper bower at the Queen of Hearts ball. That's not how it was for me. I felt old because I had strangled my youth, and I could not for the life of me imagine what lay ahead. I certainly could not have imagined that one day I would meet Tennessee Williams in the flesh. It happened in San Francisco in 1977 when he was working on a soon-to-be panned play called This Is an Entertainment at the American Conservatory Theater. I was beginning to become known locally, and so had been invited to an opening at a small South of Market art gallery. I don't remember the artwork, but it had a wannabe transgressive flavor leaning toward leather, And there, under brutal white lights, I spotted the playwright in a crowd of shiny-faced people, all scrambling to be photographed with him. He had plastered a smile on his face, but he looked bereft and empty, trapped. It was the most chilling image of fame I had ever seen thus far. I left the gallery and leaned against a car in the parking lot to smoke a joint. Williams made his escape a few minutes later. When he saw what I was doing, he approached and inquired in the softest of tones, "Would you mind terribly?" I told him not at all, so we shared the joint for several minutes, talking about nothing more than the moon and the sky. I did not try to introduce myself or be one of those fans he had fled. I knew he would prefer the kindness of a stranger. During my college days at Chapel Hill, I dated 2 girls who bore the middle name of Armistead. We weren't directly related, though the 2 of them were related to each other. They were sisters. Armistead was a distinguished old family name in Virginia, so their parents couldn't resist the urge to use it twice. I didn't date the sisters at the same time. I waited a respectful interval between them. They were both blonde and Candace Burgundy. I took one of them, I forget which, on a walk through the snowy woods of Battle Park and kissed her on a bridge above a creek where our breaths mingled like ghosts in the air. I wanted this to be a love scene out of all that heaven that allows, which it sort of was, come to think of it, since Rock Hudson and the first Mrs. Ronald Reagan had about as much chemistry in that movie as me and the lovely Miss Somebody Armistead Somebody. I wonder sometimes if these sisters ever swapped notes and discussed these romantic fizzles and knew that it had been my fault entirely. I hope so. They deserve more than a guy who got off on the incestuousness of our names and wondered if passion could be summoned on the spot by the manipulation of pretty winter scenery. I was just as chaste about the other girl I remember dating in college, and my motives were just as dubious. Kim was the daughter of a famous 40s band leader who lived with his wife, the beautiful girl singer in his band, in a big antebellum house on East Franklin Street. I was too young to remember their heyday, but I still found it glamorous to go to their house. Sometimes, when picking up their daughter, I lingered longer than most boys would, making conversation. They were Christian Scientists and a little dowdy by then, but I found glamour in the fact that they had both been in the movies, however briefly. I was dating them, in effect. Their daughter was entirely secondary. So college was a sexless curriculum for me. The lust that crept around the edges of my consciousness was purely accidental. One afternoon, looking for a place to pee on campus, I discovered a toilet in the basement of Bingham Hall, the English building. I was the only person there, but the stalls were lacquered with yellowing semen and graffiti samizdat so vividly detailed that they could qualify as novellas. As it happened, I was majoring in English, so I returned to this funky-smelling glade more than once, though I never met another person there, just the latest installment of the serials on the walls. I could move from stall to stall, catching up on things, wondering about the men who so brazenly created this literature. Luckily, my friend Clark was a fellow freshman at Chapel Hill, so I wasn't a total loner. It soon became patently clear that neither of us was cool enough to pledge a fraternity, so we joined forces with our friend Jim, who was equally ineligible, to form a merry band of 3. We called ourselves the Cabal, since we had just learned that exotic-sounding word, and we thought it would be thought it would fit us perfectly as bold, conservative freedom fighters. I was the most vocal of the 3, so it was decided, mostly by Clark, that I would run as the candidate from Grimes Dormitory for student legislature. We printed black and white posters that advertised me as a representative who'll represent. I still have no idea what that meant. Mostly it afforded an opportunity for my detractors to add the word fascist at the end of the slogan. That's how ruthless they were, those commie liberal communist bastards. My modern civilization professor, Bill Gear, was a firebrand leftist whose classroom theatrics were widely known across the campus. It was easy to think of him as a Marxist since he looked like Karl Marx, with his bald pate and frizzy white beard and deceptively twinkly eyes. I sparred with him in class on a regular basis and eventually came to look forward to that, since it gave me a sense of identity. Maybe, I have an idea. I'm going to roll off the stage now. You should have seen me going through the TSA today when I discovered I remembered that suspenders set off the goddamn. So I took them off and put them in a cup to go through the scanner, and then came through holding my pants. My pants were falling down around my knees. You have these little moments in life where you really realize you're an old man. It's really sad. All right, I'm happier though I'm not clinking against the mic. Back to Mr. Gear. One day, to my complete amazement, he invited me to lunch at the faculty dining hall, where we continued to spar, but on a more personal level. Did your father warn you about me? This threw me, of course. You specifically? He smiled, just in the abstract. All us pinkos in Chapel Hill. I shrugged. It was embarrassing to be asked this directly, since it was true. I'm a lot more like you than you know. I'm from Jonesville, South Carolina. Mr. Gear drawled out the name of his pissant country town to emphasize his point. My daddy sent me to the Citadel. I told him my father had briefly considered that hard-assed military college in Charleston for me. My brother Tony, an athletic mesomorph who was much more of a team player, would enroll at the Citadel a few years later. I put that in there just so Tony would have to look up mesomorph. You're better off here. They don't let you sass your teachers there. They make you drop and do push-ups. Mr. Gear was smiling at me with wry affection. I realized that he actually liked me, and even more amazingly, that I liked him. This man thrived on open combat, the vigorous clash of ideas. That's what he believed the university was all about. He loved the fact that we could challenge each other and still be friends. There was something more to it than that, but I would not figure that out until 15 years later when Mr. Gear looked me up in San Francisco. His wife of 30 years had died 2 years earlier, and he had since made a practice of flying to California for occasional fortnights at Esalen, the loosey-goosey New Age spa retreat above the cliffs at Big Sur. I can finally be myself there, he told me. It's a great relief. We were drinking wine on the deck of my rooftop studio in Russian Hill. Below us in the amber light of evening, there were cargo ships gliding out to sea through the Golden Gate. I was proud of my little home, a place so minuscule that I called it a pent shack, and I was thrilled when I realized why Mr. Gear had sought me out again. He was in his early 60s, I in my early 30s. I'd been an openly gay writer long enough for the gossip to circulate widely in North Carolina. I'm proud of you, he said, lifting his glass. I thanked him with a smile. Took me long enough, didn't it? You and me both, he said. And just like that, he came out to me. It occurred to me then that we had both found it easier to camouflage our queerness on the fringes of academia. He on the left, I on the right. Our constant political grandstanding had been a distraction from a deeper, more difficult truth, the one that had to be hidden at any cost. And so who was this Armistead Maupin Jr.? It's easy enough to say that he was still angling for the love of his father, because obviously he was. But he was 20 years old and out in the world, and he should have known better. I have a hard time liking him now, though I do remember as senior class vice president, he worked to have a bronze statue erected on campus to his hero, Thomas Wolfe, another restless underclassman who had grown up to write novels, and who, incidentally, had lived in Asheville when my mother lived there as a girl. And I can still relate to a sentimental young Armistead who greeted the arrival of spring on campus with a sappy song called Today by the New Christie Minstrels. You remember it? Yeah. Careful or I'll sing it. Or that song from the Fantastics about being a tender and callow fellow. He was callow all right, but his heart was still closed to the possibility of real tenderness. The lid was locked down for fear of what might escape. Or so it seemed until someone named Roger Davis came along in my senior year. Roger was a fellow student legislator who lived in one of the big new high-rise dormitories on the edge of campus. He had discovered that such places were dehumanizing, so he had renamed his dorm Maverick House and ordered Carolina blue cowboy hats for the residents to wear at ball games and pep rallies, turning them into a fraternity of sorts, and becoming, in the process, a charismatic leader. His smooth Frankie Avalon hair and soulful, deep-set eyes enchanted everyone, male or female, who ever spent time in his presence. He seemed to like me, too. Sometimes after legislative sessions, we would deliberately walk together across campus, talking about everything and nothing until I headed off to my apartment and he returned to his brother's at Maverick House. I was in love with him, I suppose, in my own crippled way, but I never dared tell him how I felt. News traveled slowly in those days, so I didn't hear about the accident until the morning after it happened. The Daily Tar Heel posted photos of the charred carcass of the death car on the front page. The car had leapt the median strip near the Glen Lennox shopping center, rolled over several times, torn through a 4x4 signpost, and finally struck a massive concrete abutment. Roger was still alive when they got him out, but not for long. This had been a one-car accident, the paper said tellingly, and the speedometer had been stuck at 90 miles an hour. That made no sense at all, since despite his affection for cowboy hats, Roger wasn't some car-crazy country boy. He was from Fort Lauderdale, the cosmopolitan beach town from where the boys are. The whole campus was rocked by the news. I attended memorial service during which a toothy co-head with a histrionic streak recited the famous lines from Romeo and Juliet. And when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night. It was a beautiful sentiment, and a lot of people cried, but I resented the way she milked it so shamelessly. She sounded like a Miss America contestant performing in the talent competition, and I'm sure she'd come nowhere close to being Roger's Juliet. Afterward, I wandered aimlessly through the crunching brown leaves of late October and tried to sort it out. The whole episode might have remained cloaked in official discretion had I not run across Chief Arthur J. Beaumont, the campus security officer, in my grief-addled ramble. Chief Beaumont was a stubby fire hydrant of a man who spewed blunt talk as freely as a hydrant spews water. He had been one of the first responders at the scene of the accident, he said, and it wasn't an accident at all, it was suicide. The kid was queer, he added, as if that naturally explained it. The awful part is, I wanted it to be true. I wanted Roger to have been like me. There were too many questions I could have asked, but I didn't. Had Roger been caught in the act with someone? Had he left a note? Had he been tormented by an unspoken love for another man? I wasn't deluded enough to think that I might be that man, but I wondered if someone out there was mourning him as intensely as I was, or at least in the same secret way. And what if I had told Roger how I felt about him? Could I have saved his life with my love? Could that moment have been the start of something unimaginably wonderful? Our own place in Fort Lauderdale after college, a life of manly tenderness in the ocean air. In a daze, I left Chief Beaumont and went back to my apartment on Gimgool Road, where I escaped into the welcome amnesia of an afternoon nap. The place was in the basement of an old towny couple's bungalow, so there was plumbing that crisscrossed the ceiling, gurgling away whenever it pleased. I had embraced this design challenge by making a rustic wooden sign that said "Pipe Dream" that I hung on the ivied wall outside the door. I never really called it that, though. The place had a typical apartment house address, the house number paired with the letter A, so I dubbed it the A-hole early on, and it stuck with all my friends. It must have been a toilet flushing that stirred me. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling until I heard footsteps on the path outside my little high-up window. Then the footsteps stopped for a moment as my visitor perused the Pipe Dream sign. He issued a boyish chuckle before he rapped on the door. I recognized that chuckle, so I hurried to the living room to open the door. "Nice place," said Roger, grinning at me as he gazed into the room. "Gee, see what you mean about those pipes." It took me a while to state the obvious. "I thought you were dead." "Stupid Tar Heel," he said with a shrug. "They mixed me up with another Roger Davis, guy over in Old East. I figured you'd want to know right away." He opened his arms to give me the hug I needed so badly. We stayed there for a long time, breathing in unison, chest to chest. I even dared to stroke the back of his head as I told him how glad I was to see him again, how I thought for sure I'd lost him forever, how I wanted to tell him right now what his friendship meant to me, because life could be short and cruel, and love should never be left unspoken. I held on to him until the sheer perfection of the moment compelled me, as it almost always does, to wake up. I recounted the story of this dream later that year in an empty classroom where a panel of 3 professors sat solemnly behind a desk. I came unprepared with notes of any kind. I just stood at the podium and spilled it all out as candidly as possible. I named Roger, of course, since everyone knew about his death, but I left out the part about Chief Beaumont and Roger's possible suicide, and the part about me loving Roger and hoping against hope that he loved me back. I made it a story about unexpressed friendship and cruel fate and the redemptive power of dreams when all else fails. Without telling them the whole truth, I tapped into my wounded heart and let them see it for a full 10 minutes, exactly. That's how I won the Mangum Medal for Oratory, the university's oldest student award, and the one of which I remain most proud to this day. It was my first real lesson in storytelling, in connecting intimately with an audience. Let them see enough of the truth to make them believe you.
Can you tell us anything you can about the upcoming Possible Tales movie?
Can I tell you anything I can about the Possible Tales movie? It's under development by Netflix. I was on the phone with them just the other day with 4 of the executive producers, myself included, and Laura Linney, who is coming back to play Mary Ann. That answers your other question in that it's set in modern times. Mrs. Madrigal is celebrating her 90th birthday party when the show begins. The tenants at 28 Barbary Lane are much more racially diverse and young, as befits the story. A lot of the old ones are back, and we're very excited about it. The writers that are on board are very much in the spirit of Tales and want to capture that same feeling, the sort of mystery story, romance, comedy, drama thing. It could happen, it's already been announced that it's under development by them, so I think they're pretty serious about it. It better be. Yes?
Yes. Who are some of the younger authors that you would personally recommend?
Oh dear, I got asked that question today, and I felt terrible about not being able to throw some at them right away. Do you know some I should be reading?
Well, I'm a friend of Stephen McCall. I know you like Armistead, but let's say Gen X.
But they're, forgive me, Stephen and Bob, but they're geezers like me. Not quite as old as I am, but remain a huge fan of Steve McCauley. Is he here tonight?
I wish.
Yeah, that would, well, forget about him then. No, he's got a book coming out, I think, very soon. I thought about him immediately, of course, when I thought about Cambridge. I love, what he does is what I would love in any book. I guess Christodora was the last new one I read. I don't know how old he is, the guy that wrote that book. I recently read, because I knew the movie was coming out and I was curious about it, I finally read Call Me By Your Name, which is so good. Yeah, lovely, lovely things. Been out for 10 years, and that's how long it took for me to get to it. It's shameful. But it's such a beautiful, lovely thing. I hope the movie is good.
So you wrote these books forever ago, right?
40
Yes.
years ago, started.
So you started this whole inspirational thing that transcends generations. And I read it for the first time. I'm a 53-year-old gay woman. I've been with my partner for like 32 years. I started reading your books this year. So, what do you think of that? I mean, you didn't.
What commune have you been hiding in? I love hearing that they're virgins, to tales. I love hearing that about it.
That's what I'm saying is, so this was written at a time when, gay identity and gay experience in life was very different than it is now. And lesbian experience is very different than it is now.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on how it's, other than selling the books, how has it evolved for you in terms of its relevance? Because it's incredibly relevant. And it's taken on a life of its own, right?
Yeah, yes. The last book was 4 years ago.
Right.
I wasn't just writing in the 70s,
No, I've only read the first 2 books.
Oh, okay. I think you'll be happy as it goes along. The 4th book, by the way, was where I dared to go to write about a women's music festival. And all of my gay male friends were saying, oh, the girls are going to be so pissed at you. And that's when lesbians first started discovering my work. And what I did was what I always do, is to put the story in the mind of a central character who's a little bit dubious about what's going on. So I sent Dee Dee to this place called Womenwood, W-I-M-M-I-N. And Dee Dee was awkward about it, and her lover was really into it, and that's the way I sort of worked my way into it. And I had Kate Clinton, the great Kate Clinton, as my spy. She told me about the time she was there, and when some redneck broke into the camp and knocked over an outhouse with a woman in it. And she said they had to hose her off at the womb. The womb was the name of a tent where people went for comfort. And I always find those kinds of institutions interesting, where people are trying to form a perfect world and don't quite succeed in doing it. I did it in my last tales, in the last of the 9 Tales novels at Burning Man, using my own cynicism, because my husband dragged me kicking and screaming to Burning Man. And of course I did find it transformative in many ways. And the Bohemian Grove in the same book that Womenwood is in, where old Republican farts go and be Republican farts. So it's been quite a ride, to answer your question. It has been a ride, and I've tried to keep up with it as much as I could, given the fact that I was aging and not all of these things were my experience anymore. I tried to find things that were that I knew about. But I know what you're saying. I'm sure there are things, I don't read the early books because I'm sure I'd cringe a little. But it was considered very bold when I brought lesbians into tales, you know. They had barely gotten used to Michael and John before I brought in Dee Dee and Dorothea. And Dorothea, by the way, her lover, who starts out as African American, you know where I'm going, right? I put her in there specifically because I realized it was an awfully lily-white cast, and I wanted to make it racially diverse. So I thought, well, I've worked at the ad agency with, you know, African American models, and she could be one of those people, and I could be convincing about her. And somebody wrote in and said, shame on you, your characters have rung true, but Dorothea is nothing in the world but a white woman in black skin. So I was really depressed until I realized that was just a fabulous fucking idea. So that's what I made her, and I could play with the idea of, was Mona in love with Dorothea because of her race? It's the sort of liberal dilemma, you know. How much of it was about her and what she thought she was and what she represented to her. And then 2 years ago, Twitter went crazy saying that I had predicted Rachel Dolezal, which of course I had. So it's a ride. And you'll see those things, you know, if you want to continue after I've put you on the spot like this when you were so kind as to ask a question.
Dyke, who just read your book, as a 56-year-old Dyke, I read in Serial Live when I was in high school, everything you wrote. And so to answer her question, reading it again today, it's sort of, I guess, like how straight kids feel about looking through their high school yearbooks.
Oh, that's a nice way to put it.
But so it's a bit, the original question, reason I was raising my hand was I was curious in terms of, if you don't mind my getting back to this book at hand, did you write, did you put logical families together chronologically, like 1, 2, 3, 4?
No, it jumps around.
Yeah, I had that sense.
It jumps around. I take it up to, you can see that story about Mr. Gere. I brought it up forward 15 years, and then I go back, and I circle back, and I use a lot of the techniques I used in Tales, that I learned in Tales, because I realized that it was effective, you know, that you could build suspense and make it work like a story. That's what I know how to do. And I have been telling, you know, anecdotes about myself for years, the one of which is in the book here, when I ended up in the Oval Office with Nixon. That was one of the easier ones to write because I was on the fucking tapes. The son of a bitch was taping me. So I've been told this story for years, and Douglas Brinkley, the historian, was writing a book on John Kerry a few years back, and talked to me about it, and I told him what I remembered, and then he came back and said, well, it sort of all bears out. It's a lot funnier than you told it, but I immediately panicked when he said, we've checked the tapes, because I thought he's caught me in a lie. I mean, you know, I make my stories better as the years go on, but what happened, the short version of it is that I took some vets, recent Vietnam vets, back to Vietnam to build houses for Vietnamese sailors, wounded people. It was ostensibly a humanitarian effort, but it was completely orchestrated by the Dirty Tricks Department, in an effort to make Nixon look good when John Kerry was making him look very bad. And so we were in the Oval Office with Nixon, and he was talking to us, and there were 10 of us, I guess. And at one point he said, you know, the Vietnamese women are not very attractive. Who am I making him sound like? Not like Nixon. This odd thing about how Vietnamese women weren't especially attractive, but when they wear the little ao dais and they're flying along on their bicycles like little butterflies, and it's so creepy. Yeah, it might have been a lovely thing if a woman had said it, but you know, for this guy with 5 o'clock shadow and jowls, it was very, very creepy. And I realized he was trying to do guy talk. He was trying to talk to me like Trump was talking to Billy Bush about, you know, something, by the way, that all men recognize because we've all been present when that happens in private, when men try to prove to each other they're men by talking nasty about women. And that's what he was doing with the only queer in the Oval Office at the time. So, yeah, that started out somewhere. I don't remember I don't know if it answered your question, but the form of it was fun to deal with. I mean, you know, to realize I didn't have to be completely linear, and it might be boring if I was completely linear. Sometimes when I read memoirs, I think, well, I don't care about their high school years. I'll just skip ahead to the point where something happens. You couldn't really do that with this book. Yes?
2 points. One is that I came out in 1981, and your books were kind of a lifesaver for me. I moved 2,000 miles away from home, and they gave me the hope that there was a wonderful life still available. Harkening back to today, we now have a 71-year-old straight woman tenant downstairs, and we got her.
I thought you were going to say Trump. I was really. It's hard to pick one word for him, isn't it? You know.
We got her hooked on the books from the very beginning. She read the first one in a night, and she's read the whole series. And lastly, it prompted me to make you a present, which I've had since last Christmas. And I tried to get Matt Albert to give them to you. But
Oh, how sweet. You know Matt?
I haven't met him yet, but
You will. He's a sweetie pie. I know. I'm a little nervous.
It's fine. I made a dozen of them for friends.
Oh, how sweet. Long live Anna and Mouse, it says. I will share that with Olympia Dukakis, and she'll probably wear it. That is so sweet. Thank you so much. You know, that 71-year-old woman is Mary Ann. I mean, I have a lot of 70-year-old women come up to me and say, I'm Mary Ann Singleton. And I say, no, you're not. I am. I drew on my own, you know, Babe in the Woods experience a lot in that first book.
Yeah. I feel like we're probably all here to some degree because we've gone out into the world and had to find our own logical families. And I'm curious if you can kind of talk about that, either in a broad brush or specific way.
Thank you for that. I think we have. I don't think it's just a gay thing, by the way. I think it's clearer than ever in modern times. I think this is going to be the most ill-attended Thanksgiving and Christmas season ever for anybody that has to go back to Florida or anywhere else. I coined that phrase for Michael Tolliver Lives, the book that was out 10 years ago. And Mrs. Madrigal says it, well, dear, you have your biological family and you have your logical family. And my husband, the chief member of my logical family, said you should name the memoir that, because that's what we have. You look around at the really precious people in your life, the people who accept you unconditionally for who you are. It's not to say that it's all roses, but it's a lot better than having to count on the same blood to love someone. It's a really foolish reason, actually. Especially if they're not supporting you or they're voting for candidates, for heaven's sakes, that are actively working to thwart your life in some way. And I think it's because we've been, gay people in particular, have been so nice about it. we shut up when Trumpy old Aunt Beatrice, Trumpy, I said Trumpy, goes on about that shit. And they said, well, I'm a Republican, I've always been a Republican. And, well, goodbye. It's not tolerable after a while, especially when you get to be a certain age. I'm now experiencing what Christopher Isherwood referred to when I was 30. Well, he wrote it in his diary, and I just read it recently, that he had senile resentments, and I thought, I have those. Just don't want to put up with it anymore. It's not to say that members of your biological family can't also be part of your logical family. I've got a bunch of those too, and they're great, and there's nothing like it. You can share so much with each other. But I just used it for that reason, because that's what it comes down to for me, and I think a lot of people are feeling that right now with the horrible thing that's happening in Washington. I was there last night at the Smithsonian making a speech, and you know you're old when they invite you to the museum. But I got off the train at Union Station, and normally I have a real thrill in being in Washington. My grandmother lived near there when I was a little boy, and you'd see those amazing buildings. And my feeling about the town always survived through Republican and Democratic administrations. It was still wonderful, old, constant, beautiful Washington. And I looked at it this time and thought, there's an invading army here. I looked at the Capitol and thought, not one fucking thing is happening in that building to do us any good. And there are plenty of Democrats to blame for that, as well as the Republican fascist administration. So that's kind of what I wanted to sum it up. I called it fascist 8 months ago when I submitted the manuscript, and I thought, well, you might regret that. No. No, you should have seen me on the elevator in Washington, where there was two tall guys and me on the elevator. And they had round, sort of rosette, sort of like insignia buttons on. And I said, what are those things for? And they said, the Attorney General. And I realized they were guards or something. And I said, you mean? He probably needs guards. Somebody might pick him up and run off with him. I shouldn't be mocking him for his height, because that's really the best thing about him, I guess. He's probably had to suffer like many of the rest of us for that when he was younger. But all of the evil they're up to. You can see them ticking off, basically erasing any scrap of Obama's legacy. Trying to, anyway. I think the goodness lingers. I saw him sending greetings to Michelle on their 25th anniversary, sort of obviously something that had been cooked up with the TV thing, where he was paying tribute to her, and he called her his partner and his best friend, and it was just the loveliest thing going on between a man and his wife, and not from the standpoint of the mighty man and the little woman who's always stood behind him. Not a scrap of it, of course. And I thought about Trump shaking hands with his wife and then saying, go sit over there. So that's where I got the title from. All that bitterness that I knew was coming. Yes, sir. You're the last one, I guess, right?
So, since you've talked about a few things that you've read, memoirs, what's the art? What are the books that you're returning to sort of refresh and get away from some of the daily news? Are you returning to things that you've read before, or are you constantly looking for new and
The question is, when I read, what is my comfort reading? Well, Christopher Isherwood, someone I considered reading to you about tonight, who was sort of a mentor of mine, is always there for me because I can hear his voice. I can hear the voice of the living man in his work. And that's a lovely thing, that just survives through the ages. I also am still very close friends with his surviving partner, Don Bacardi, who's now 83 and sounds exactly like Chris. Something that happened not long after they moved in together. They've actually addressed this. Don says that he's a natural mimic and he can't help it. He's not trying to be pretentious because he sounds like this old man. It's just something he got from the man he loved, and it's still with him, at 83. So reading in general I think is very healthy in this time. The centering act of reading. And you can sit there and look at, scroll through your social media all day long and make yourself crazy. You can do it really easily. And I'm terrible about it. I'll get in bed with my husband and say, I'll give him wrap up of the news of the day. It's like 5 different freaky things that don't have no relationship to each other usually. But so I think, and it's wonderful just to sit and read. Confession, in the presence of a bookstore, I read on a Kindle because it's lit. I can make the letters really big. You saw me struggling with this here. And there's something kind of cozy about it. It is a terrible confession because the room always goes silent when I say it. Well, I guess that was, we can't leave with Kindle. Are you asking something?
Me?
Yeah.
Sure, why not?
No, you went.
Why don't you end on a note of hope?
Well, will I end on a note of hope?
Something hopeful, something nice to walk out with.
Have I just bummed you out tonight?
Some levity.
Some levity. You haven't had any laughs tonight. Well, that's pressure. See, this is the guy that they warn you about when they say only 2 questions. Okay, I've had a great time. Thank you. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.